Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really surprising, high-stakes medical mystery, and that is the diagnostic overlap between autism and schizophrenia. Now, if you're already familiar with the neurodiversity space, you know it can get pretty complex. But today, we're zeroing in on a very specific, almost unbelievable phenomenon: diagnostic overshadowing and misdiagnosis. We're going straight to the latest clinical data, including some fascinating research by Dr. Neff and insights from Psychology Today to figure out how two vastly different neurological profiles can get so tangled up in a clinical setting. It's a wild ride, and as you'll see, getting this right is absolutely crucial.
So let's start right at the heart of the mystery. You might be wondering, how in the world could two conditions that seem so vastly different on the surface be confused by trained medical professionals? I mean, on one hand, you have a lifelong developmental condition. On the other, a serious mental health disorder characterized by psychosis. It honestly sounds impossible that a doctor could mix them up, right? But the literature shows this happens way more often than we'd like to think. And to understand why, we really have to look past our basic assumptions and dig into the actual mechanics of a psychiatric evaluation. Clinicians rely heavily on observing external behaviors. But the tricky part is, identical outward behaviors can actually stem from entirely different internal realities.
Get a load of this statistic. 1 in 4 autistic adults report receiving a completely different mental health diagnosis before their autism was ever recognized. 1 in 4. And for autistic women, it's actually 1 in 3. Now sure, some of those prior diagnoses might have been accurate as co-occurring conditions, but the reality is the underlying autism was totally missed. That means people's genuine mental health challenges were being treated completely outside the context of their actual neurodivergent brains. That is a massive, system-wide blind spot, and it totally sets the stage for the specific, dangerous confusion between autism and schizophrenia that we're talking about today.
Okay, let's act like detectives for a second and establish our baselines. First up, autism. What is it really? Well, as the sources define it, autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition present from day one. It is an entirely different way of processing the world. We're talking about built-in sensory differences where the nervous system responds uniquely to light or sound or texture. It involves distinct social and communication patterns that often clash with neurotypical expectations, and it features something called monotropism, which is this passionate, intense focus on special interests. The absolute key takeaway here is the timeline and the nature of it. Autism is a foundational, lifelong operating system. It's not an illness that just suddenly pops up one day.
Now let's flip the coin and look at schizophrenia. In sharp contrast, this is a mental health condition that usually has its onset much later in life, typically in adolescence or early adulthood. So unlike autism, which is there from birth, schizophrenia represents a pretty drastic shift from a person's previous baseline. It's characterized primarily by psychosis, meaning the person might experience false beliefs, which we call delusions, or they might hear and see things that just aren't there, which are hallucinations. It also heavily involves disorganized thinking and speech. When you put these two definitions side by side, they sound like apples and oranges. So, where exactly is the confusion coming from?
Well, Dr. Neff's research maps out exactly how this happens. It turns out two entirely distinct internal experiences can actually share a highly confusing, messy middle ground of external behaviors. There are moments where the outward presentation of an autistic person who is just trying to navigate a neurotypical world heavily mimics the clinical signs of a developing psychotic disorder. If a clinician is only looking at that surface-level distress and they don't understand the lifelong neurodevelopmental context behind it, they can so easily jump to the exact wrong conclusion.
So the crucial point here is that a clinician might observe 4 specific traits that act as massive red herrings. These traits completely obscure the autistic lived experience underneath. In the clinical world, schizophrenia is often diagnosed based on signs of paranoia, delusions, hearing voices, and what psychiatrists call negative symptoms, things like a totally flat emotional affect or severe loss of motivation. If a doctor sees these, alarm bells for schizophrenia immediately start ringing, but the source data reveals something wild. An undiagnosed autistic adult can present with behaviors that perfectly mimic every single one of these 4 categories. Let's break down exactly how this misinterpretation happens trait by trait.
Let's start with paranoia. Imagine you're an autistic person, and you're really struggling to interpret neurotypical subtleties at your job. You start to think, hey, everyone is talking about me. So you share this with your therapist. The therapist immediately thinks, boom, paranoia. But let's look at the autistic reality. This is actually a textbook example of the double empathy problem. The autistic person isn't having a baseless psychotic break. They are accurately perceiving a real disconnect in communication. They know they're missing subtle social cues, and they know their coworkers are reacting to them differently. So that feeling that people are talking about me is actually rooted in a highly logical deduction about their environment. It is not a paranoid delusion.
Now, take it a step further. What happens when that therapist attempts a reality check? The therapist says, well, I don't think your coworkers are actually talking about you. The autistic client, knowing what they've observed, insists on it, and they start getting agitated. Suddenly, the clinician suspects a deeply entrenched delusion. But the reality here? It's cognitive rigidity and a strong adherence to observed facts. The autistic person has gathered real data indicating a social mismatch. When the therapist invalidates that data, it causes profound distress and dysregulation. So what the therapist observes as a fixed false belief is actually just an autistic person desperately trying to communicate a very real social experience using a rigid, literal cognitive style.
Okay, this next scenario from the sources is just mind-blowing, and it perfectly captures the danger of literal misunderstanding. An undiagnosed autistic teen has a major meltdown. Her parents are worried, so they take her to the doctor. The doctor does a standard psychiatric screening and asks, "Do you hear voices?" The autistic teen, processing language very literally, thinks, "Well, yes, I am hearing your voice right now, and I hear my parents' voices in the hall." So she answers, "Yes." And just like that, a literal interpretation of a really vague question becomes documented medical evidence of auditory hallucinations in her chart. Isn't that wild?
And it gets even more complicated when you factor in burnout. When an autistic person experiences severe burnout, it causes massive social withdrawal and low motivation. Clinicians see this and immediately think of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Let's go back to that teen. After her massive meltdown, she's completely exhausted. Her parents describe her as unmotivated, saying she's withdrawn from all her friends. In the schizophrenia world, these are called negative symptoms: avolition, alogia, and hedonia. But in autism, this is a textbook description of autistic burnout. It's a state of profound physical and mental exhaustion caused by masking and navigating a world designed for neurotypical brains. Again, the external behavior is identical, but the internal mechanism couldn't be more different. So, if you're a clinician, how do you actually separate the two? Well, you have to build a clear framework based on 3 things to figure out why it might be autism and not schizophrenia. First, you look at the timeline. Was this present from birth, or did it suddenly appear in late adolescence? Second, the core traits. Is the distress coming from a literal break with reality, or is it coming from sensory overload and an environment that just doesn't fit? And third, the focus. Is the person experiencing a generalized loss of pleasure in life, or do they still have deep, passionate, monotopic interests that just happen to be non-typical? A thorough, deep dive assessment of a person's entire lifespan is literally the only way to get this right. And getting this right is absolutely crucial because the consequences of an inaccurate diagnosis are just devastating. Treating an autistic person for schizophrenia means subjecting them to heavy, intense antipsychotic medications that they do not need, which exposes them to severe and harmful side effects. It saddles them with the immense stigma attached to psychotic disorders, but honestly, worst of all, it forces them into a lifetime of continued masking. That leads to deeper burnout because they are completely missing out on the tailored, neuro-affirming support and accommodations they actually need to thrive in this world. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. To truly understand neurodiversity, we absolutely must look past the surface and listen to the person inside. If a clinical label has always felt wrong to a patient, well, maybe it is. We have to move beyond just checking off external behaviors on a clipboard and start asking why those behaviors are happening in the first place. Are we pathologizing a perfectly logical autistic response to a confusing world by calling it a delusion? Because until our medical systems start valuing the internal lived experiences of neurodivergent people just as much as they value their own clinical observations, these tragic misdiagnoses will just keep happening. Thanks so much for diving into this complex explainer with me.